Welcome everybody to the Building Kubernetes UIs with Octant session. I appreciate everyone's time and coming and joining me today. So I'm just going to dive right in, and we're going to start with the some quick slides, and then we're going to get into a demo. So questions, we'll take questions at the end over voice. But while I'm doing the presentation, I'm just going to let some of the folks here who are moderating field some questions, and we'll keep things flowing until the end, and then whatever we have time for, we'll do as many questions as we can. So using Octant to build Kubernetes UIs. As the title slide says, my name is Witzel. I am the team lead and maintainer for Octant. And what I'm gonna be talking about today is kind of quick overview of what Octant is. I'm making some assumptions that some people already know what it is, but go into it quickly. We'll talk about the advantages of using Octant over building your own, kind of how the plugin system works, and then we'll do a demo of live coding up a TypeScript plugin. So the Octant platform, we call it a platform on purpose. It accesses a cluster using local credentials. It is an application, so there is no service to deploy. There's nothing extra to do in cluster. It's made up of modules, so it can provide details into specific areas of a cluster. Octant ships with a set of default modules. Some you may be familiar with are like applications, namespace overview, cluster overview. We'll see some of those as we go through the actual demo of building a plugin. We use Clarity components just to create a consistent UI. And most importantly, it supports plugins. So kind of advantages of using Octant, there's no front-end coding, right? You don't have to worry about HTML, CSS, things like that. There's no deployment hosting. Again, uses Clarity for a consistent UI. Has a very fast feedback loop when you're dealing with the TypeScript plugins. And it's easy to get started, and there's a community and support. So we'll quickly talk about how the plugin system works, and then we'll get right into writing a plugin. I want to leave as much time for that as possible. So at a high level, plugins can extend Octant kind of in the following ways. We have this summary page, which has a resource overview. And you know, just to help frame this a little bit, I can show that real quick. So you come in here. This is the summary page with so we're on the pod resource, and this is the summary page. So that's what I'm referring to when I say the resource overview, the resource overview summary page. So we can add config, status, and actual components to that page. We can add new tabs to that page. I don't know if you saw, but there's a tabbed interface there. We can extend individual object status. We can add action handlers. These will become important as we want to make interactions within Octant. And then we can also add new modules. And as we talked about before, Octant ships with a set of modules, but plugins can add their own modules. So everything in Octant is module-based. The plugins themselves, they declare what they want to do. There's a capabilities map, and that map just says, hey, I work with these GVKs. I intend to print. I intend to write a tab. Status handler, I'm a module. And that's kind of the real fast how plugins in Octant are enabled. So now let's get into actually just building a plugin. So I have some code up at this repo, github.com witzel3/code connect 2020. I wasn't able to get this shared out beforehand, so I apologize for that, but feel free to go there, pull down the code. You can follow along. And so now we will start to build a plugin. So the first thing we do for Octant is we have it running, right? So I did this ahead of time, but here I have, I mean, I can close it and show, but here I just have an Octant running. This is off master, but it's pinned to 0.16, so it is running, and this is what you'll see from it is this window right here. So this was what we were looking at before. This is our pod view. So again, we were talking about modules, namespace overview module, cluster overview module, applications module, and what we're going to be dealing with here is plugins. So we don't have any plugins installed, so let's remedy that and get one going. So what we're going to do is I've already pre-installed the Yo generator and this project Octant generator Octant plugin. What that is it's a package that will actually help you scaffold out and build a plugin. So you can see I get prompted with this menu and I say, yeah, I want to do an Octant plugin. We're going to call this the Code Connect 2020 plugin, and just type in some description like that. And it finds the default path for Octant plugins. And what it's doing now is it's pulling in all of the resources and installing them locally. Everything I need to actually run this plugin and take advantage of the TypeScript system. So you don't really have to think about, oh, what do I need or what do I build out? This scaffold does all that for you. So once that's completed, we'll be presented with a set of NPM commands. The one we're going to use today specifically is the plugin watch command. Now, what this does is it will run, transpile all the TypeScript into the JavaScript format. Octant internally requires ES5, so we transpile everything from TypeScript into ES5, and then it loads that plugin into the directory. Now, if we go back, you can see now we actually have this plugin installed, and we can start to look at kind of how things are set up here. So this plugin is a module. It works with set namespace, and it has a printer and tab configuration. So we can actually go look at those things now, and we can see that the pod here, as we pull it up, it will have these new entries under configuration, plugin foo config, plugin foo status, and we have this new tab, which wasn't there before. All of this is provided by the plugin. We also have this new menu. It's the one we just created. This was generated for us by the plugin. This is dummy data that gets scaffolded in. It's just included as part of the output to give you something to look at. So we can go and view these random details, and we can see a list of entities. Now, this by itself right here is not very useful, but what is useful is if we go and start to explore the code, we can see that we will be looking at exactly what we just looked at in the UI. So we can see here we've got our name of the plugin. This is also used as our plugin path, the sum description, that's what we typed in. You can see here, here's that array of what we support, pod, GVK, set namespace, things like that. So what I want to do is I'll go through and I'll show each piece as it's represented in the front end. So this is the print handler we saw before. Here's the plugin foo config with that little message, plugin status config with the message, and this card with extra information. Again, we can view that in the pod, and we can see down here we have extra information, and we have those two entries here and the tab. The tab is defined in the tab handler, which we can get to through the outline of the code here. And we can see we've got two cards, body A, body B, and we pack them in with half width. And that's what we see here on the front end, two cards packed in with half width. So that gives you like a really quick tour of kind of like what gets provided for you, how things kind of look in the code, and what you can expect when you use that scaffold. So now let's actually go and make this do something useful. So I created a little service, which is what you saw when I first pulled up the code editor. Now this service is something that's very simple. It just serves some YAML. And these YAMLs are deployments and services. They're kind of wrapped in this object, and we created some endpoints to kind of fetch them out. So what I'm going to do with this plugin is I want to actually show that endpoint here represented as a table. So to do that, we need to go and see, okay, how does that table get generated? Well, this is the module for a plugin, which we know is the content handler, right? Content handlers are right here, and this is also where the navigation handler is. Content handler is what is used when a plugin is acting as a module, so it's a free-form content page. This is using a helper from our routers to generate this response. So if we go look at the routes, we can see we have this list of routes, and we have this list handler, get handler, not found handler. So our list handler, which is the default route, as you saw there, I'll call that out again. See, we have default and not found. These are used by the system to, if it can't find a match, it will route to like some default handler or a not found handler, depending on how it's set up. So what we're going to look at here is this list handler. Now, the list handler currently is using that that fake set of entities, right? This is defined up here. We have this entity and entity column. So first thing we want to do is we're going to create our set of entities for our deployments, right? So I'm going to remove all of this and just pop in this set of deployment columns. And then down here in our actual list unit, we'll see that we now need to update this to be deployment columns. And instead of using the static entities that we're using right here, we're going to replace this whole thing, and we'll walk through this. But what we're going to replace it with is an HTTP client call that's going to our endpoint, right? And then for each result we get out of the endpoint, we're going to pack it into a table row. Table rows hold components for each cell. So we're going to have a link and some text, right? And just this right here should be enough. If I save this, right, we can go out, we can see that files changed, no errors, and it is refreshed the plugin. So now when we go to the front end, we can see now that the plugin now represents the data that I just added to the table. If we click out, oh, we get not found. So we can see that the old links are still trying to reference the entities, right? But we've changed it all to be deployments. So let's go ahead and update the nav and the router and get that all working again. So in routes, right, what we're going to want to do here, change all this to say deployments, right? Deployments. And here we'll even change this and make that say deployment name, like that. So that'll change the route matching for our package. And then on our actual page here, we see we have that entities here. We go ahead and change that to say deployments as well. And one last final thing is the navigation, which is what you see in the module menu when you fly out here. This is defined separately to give you the ability to assign icons and craft custom header messages. So we'll also want to go ahead and change that to say deployments as well. So we'll save this. Again, we'll see the output, no errors, everything's re-rendering. Come back, and now this reads deployments. Our flyout menu reads deployments, and we can click successfully through to deployments. If we click here, we're getting these undefined messages. And if you remember in the routes, I changed the entity name. Likely we're going to have to do some updates here to get this information displaying in the way we want. So with that said, actually, let's go ahead and change this detail view. And what we'll do with the detail view, which is defined in the Git handler that we looked at before, we're going to change this to say deployments. And really, the main thing we want to do first is we just want to kind of show this, show the YAML maybe that we're gonna be installing. So we're going to use that same HTTP client that we used before. It comes off of this, which is passed into your handler. This is just a reference to the instance of Octant Plugin, and the HTTP client is provided by that runtime for you. The other thing we'll want to do is we're going to go ahead and update this param here, right? Because we're going to need that actual deployment name, right? So if we save that, that will rerun. And in here, we'll see, okay, the deployment name is there, and we're fetching the actual thing. So now let's go ahead and add that view that we want, which is just a view to see all of the YAML that we might be installing when we use this. So we will add an editor factory. Editors are a Monaco editor, and so we need to add that import up at the top. That's a component that's provided by Octant. And then one of the features of content responses is if you nest your content, like so, it will generate it as tabs. So we'll save that file. Things will be regenerated here for us. And then when we pop back in to the plugin, we now have our YAML tab just displaying that data from the endpoint that we fetched. So now that we're looking at this, we're like, wow, this tab name's horrible and breadcrumbs don't go anywhere. And so let's go ahead and make that a little more useful. What we'll need to do here is we're going to go ahead, and the title is what Octant uses to reference all of these things. So we're going to actually change our title up here, and we're going to change them to link factories. Before they were text factories. Now they're links with a reference here. And then the other thing we want to make sure we update is the actual title of our tabs. So before, we were setting the flex layout title to the same title as the previous component. This was okay, but the problem is now that it's being rendered as a tab, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us. So what we're going to do is we're going to set this to a new text factory, and in there we'll just call it the details tab. And this is a list of components. So we'll call the toComponent function on the factory itself, and that will be it. No, there's an error. So if we look at what the error, it says it must be string number or a symbol, and that is because this needs to have the title attribute added to it. So now we have all that set up. We can save this. And again, double check, make sure we got no errors. And now when we're back out here, this is a lot more useful. We have this YAML, we have details, and this pops us back out up into deployments. So now that we can kind of get around a little bit, well, I want to actually install this thing. So let's go ahead and enable that. So to do that, I'm going to use what we call grid actions. The tables themselves support grid actions. And to enable a grid action, all we have to do is define our set of grid actions that we want to install, and then assign them to the table. Once we've done that, then we can add them to our action handler. So let me show you how I would do this. Our table, our list handler here, where we're creating our table, I'm going to create a helper function. What this helper function is going to do is create my deployment grid actions. I'm going to let VS Code automatically import the grid action factory for me. I can see here I have an action path. It's namespaced. Actions within Octant are global, so we recommend plugin authors namespace their action paths. This one here is taking a object and a client ID. The client ID will be used later for alerting. So now that we have that, we can just go right up into here, and on our row, right, we can assign this grid action, and we can just do deployment grid actions, and from here we'll pass in the params client ID and our deployment like that. Save that file. And now what we'll see when we go back out to the front end is that we have a grid action rendered on our table. Here, install, right? Currently does nothing. And the reason is, if we remember from looking at this page, the actions handler does not define that action that we just put into our grid handler. So let's go take care of that next. Moving through, we're going to go back into our main plugin, right? And we're going to go up to where we defined our set of actions that we want to handle. And we're going to add that action that we just created. And that is the install deployment action. And once we have that, we can then create an action handler that will deal with that. So here we've created an action. This is our install deployment action. Again, we're using that HTTP client that we've been using to fetch deployments. Here we're subscribing to the current namespace, which is a behavior subject or an RxJS behavior subject. This is going to ensure that we get the current namespace that's selected in Octant. And then we just run an update with that YAML that we got out. And then we're going to go ahead and alert the user and just say like, hey, that was successful. So I'll save all that. We see regenerated. We come back in and I should be able to click install here and we get an alert. It says, hey, you've installed those things. Let's go take a look. Back out into Octant, filter these items, and we can see there's now a service, deployments, pods, all from me clicking that install button on the table. And we can even, just to verify that things are happy, use the port forward and see that there's content. So let's go back to our plugin. So one big issue here is that it says it's not installed. So let's go ahead and just, let's go ahead and take care of that. And I'm going to create two functions. One function is just a function that will generate an installed message. And the other function is one that will check for the actual deployment. So that's what these here look like. Now you can see this is referencing something, a V1 deployment. When we scaffold out the plugin, we include the Kubernetes client node package with it. And the reason we do that is for this very reason right here, is so when you fetch things using our dashboard client, you can then typecast them to the type you're expecting it to be. And then you can use those types to access properties that you would expect to exist for various things. So what we've done here is we've created this Git deployment. This fetches out a deployment based on this set of matching labels. We're using list here just because I wanted to show that you can do matching label selectors. You could also do this with just a Git since we know the name of it. And then the install message will take a deployment if it's defined and return a link to it. And if not, it'll say not installed. So with that, now we can actually go and we can say, okay, instead of this deployment message here, right, saying, just saying, hey, not installed, right? Let's make a call to Git deployment, right? And then we'll take that and we will also update our deployment here to now use our install message, right? So we'll save that. And we get an error. We can't find it looks like I had a typo in my snippet when I pasted it in, and I very, very much do, right? So there's an example of the compiler checking for you and saying, hey, that didn't work. So now we will go back to our plugin page and we will see that we have a set, oh, we'll see that we have nothing. We have nothing because I did something wrong. So the deployment action is apparently not. I have a backup, so it's okay. But let's see if we can. I don't really have time to debug. I did not give myself time to debug. But so we're going to continue to progress forward while I in my head trying to figure out what's going on here. So the next step that we would move to is we would add the printer and config links. Well, we can actually, you know what we can do? We can go out and we can see there's probably some error happening here in the console. And through that, we would be able to determine that we have some type of issue with the endpoint that we're running. So likely, I just need to fix that somewhere. Unfortunate. So we'll move on to, so what this was going to do was going to reflect that this was now showing installed versus just a static message. And the next part of this would be to then move on and show the details. So to get back to the details, right, I'm going to have to revert some of this here. Oh, you know what? I actually, as I was doing that, hold on. As I was doing that, I realized that the deployment name there and this here were different. That should be, let's see if I can find it. Everything's falling apart on me. I want to stop with 5 minutes left for questions. So I'm gonna try and fix this while I just talk through it. So this before was my old text factory. That was, so now what I'm gonna do here is I'll console log this V1 deployment out just because I'm curious, like, hey, is that working? Right, so this is gonna run, the plugin's gonna update. So I see I've got my things back. So let's go back and check my logs and see, yeah, it looks like I'm getting an object back in my logs. So there's something happening there. So this call here to install was not working correctly. And the reason is because I was passing it the wrong thing. So if we go back here and you can see what I was passing it was this deployment, and what I needed to be passing it was the V1 deployment. Probably could have saved myself some headache there, oops, by putting type checking on that. So there, like that. Nope, not a semicolon, right? And we'll save it. And hopefully the result here is that this is generated again. And look at that. Now we have our link to show that it's installed. And we can click through and get to our object. So now let's see. So it is a little annoying that I can't get back to the thing I was just looking at. So with this last minute that I have here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to implement the ability to link back to the plugin content from the pod printer, which we showed before. And what it was doing was just showing these fake statuses, right? So we're going to replace all of that pod content with links to real stuff. We're going to say that our plugin now deals with services, deployments, and pods. We're going to add in the link factory and v1 object meta. And then we're going to go ahead and in our print handler down here, we're going to add in this match label where it's going to look for the label. And if you have the label that you're managed by our plugin, it's going to go ahead and render a link back to the application itself. So let's see if that worked. We saved it. We go into our deployment. It looks like we might have some type of error there. So let's, oh yeah. So if we look here, we can see that we did not register our plugin to handle those types. So quickly before I stop for handling any questions, we'll add those in as supported. Actually, don't use a tab at all, so we can remove that as well. We'll see here that we're running, generating, things look good there. Our printer is updated and says it does service apps and deployments. And now when we go, say, look at our simple app pod, right, it links right back to our simple app details page, right? The next thing we are going to do is, let's see, I can do this, I have time. The next thing we'll do real quick is we're gonna make this details page a little bit better. This is just not very overall useful. So what we'll do is we'll go back into our content. This is our Git handler. And here, what we want to do is we want to have just kind of like an internal summary that we actually use, right? Something like that. And then we're going to have a external summary. So we'll call it like the K8 summary. And we will put that right here above the API details. Now you can see it's asking for a v1 service here. We can import that. It's also asking for the summary factory. We can import that. Now we can take those old entities, right? We can change the names here. We can say like Kubernetes, and instead of saying that this is a text factory, we're going to use our Kate's summary, and that will to component like that. And we'll do the same thing up here because we'll import that, but we'll do the same thing for our body of the entity details. And I believe we called that the internal summary to component like that. So this is actually calling out to the Kubernetes API and making GET calls, rendering that stuff into a link in the summary page. And then if it can't get the information, it's just rendering out a not installed. So we'll save that. We'll make sure that everything compiled fine. And then in a second, we should see that this will refresh. And there we go. We now have the new details page, which links out to our deployment and links out to our service. And then also contains the content from our internal API, which is rendering here in the details 1. And it looks like I've got a couple minutes. So I think at this point, what I'll do, the GitHub repo itself has full the full everything, and you can go see everything that we did. But the thing that we didn't make it through in this demo was the delete action, and then also table loading. So this table, when you call delete, this table goes to red, and the action grid goes away until the resource is fully deleted. And that's not the only thing we didn't get to in that short time period. So now I'll just field any questions that folks might have, and yeah, thank you.
All right, no questions so far in the Q&A, so I'm just monitoring. Anybody have questions?
So I see there's a question about Python example. So officially we support Go plugins and we support TypeScript plugins. There is a Python example, but it's there as kind of a, because Go is using gRPC, or the Go plugin side is using gRPC. It's kind of there as like a, you can use gRPC to do plugins, and any language that has gRPC, you can generate the clients for and use it. But beyond that, you're kind of on your own if you want to step outside of either Go or TypeScript. I see someone said, thanks.
Yep. ES just says, thanks. Thanks for listening.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. You're welcome. And I appreciate everyone's time.
Cool. Thank you, Wayne. Before we wrap up, because it looks like there's no other questions, I sent a survey link out in the chat. If you have some time, please take the survey so that we can get your feedback on the session and just kind of help us make decisions on what future Code Connect conferences look like. Oh, we have a question from Richard, if we want to answer that before we head out.
Yeah, sure. Are there any plans? So the question is there plans to expand the documentation for what controls are available and how? Also simplify UI building so it's less factory and more JavaScript UI native. Yes, so very good question, Richard. Yeah, so yes, we are going to be creating a suite of documentation focused around plugin authoring, and it's going to exist at reference.octant.dev. It's a storyboard site right now, or a storybook site right now, and we are going to be adding narrative documentation to that to kind of guide people in building plugins. And then as for less factory and more JavaScript UI native, yeah, that's kind of a hard problem. So for two reasons. One, none of us on the team are like super great TypeScript, JavaScript developers. So we're kind of learning as we go. But the other part is that we're generating these libraries from our Go components. And so we're using a lot of metadata programming to like generate this output, and we're having to like annotate things and add more context to these components. So getting them to the point where we can just auto generate them and have them feel like JavaScript UI native is something that we will converge towards, but I can't say exactly when that'll be available.
Awesome. Well, if no one else has any questions, I guess we can just wrap up here. If you had any last words, Wayne or George.
Yeah, my last words would be check us out on octant.dev, the GitHub for the plugin library is the plugin library for Octant under the VMware Tanzu. You can get the repo for the plugin I just did at Code Connect 2020, and we're on Slack and in the Octant channel, and we're on Twitter at Project Octant. So please reach out and let us know if you're building a plugin.